This is the story of a woman who built an empire on the backs of children. A woman who smiled for cameras, collected awards for her charity work, and was praised as a saint in her community. But behind those walls, she was running one of the most calculated, cold-blooded fraud schemes in modern history. And she would have gotten away with it, if not for one teenager's courage and a hidden diary that exposed everything. Welcome to Dark Echoes Crime, where we expose the darkest secrets hidden behind closed doors, the crimes that shatter perfect facades, and the justice that finally catches up to those who think they're untouchable. If you're here for stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the people around you, hit that subscribe button, because today's story will haunt you. This is the story of Rebecca Thornfield, the adoption fraud queen who stole millions, destroyed lives, and thought she'd never face consequences. Until the day a 17-year-old boy walked into a courtroom with evidence that would unravel her entire empire and send her away for decades. Buckle up. This one gets dark. Rebecca Thornfield was the kind of woman people admired. She lived in a sprawling estate in Westchester County, New York, one of those picture-perfect colonial homes with white columns and manicured lawns that screamed old money and good taste. She drove a Mercedes, wore designer clothes, and never missed a charity gala. Her social media was filled with smiling photos of her with children, always children, each post accompanied by heartfelt captions about the joy of giving kids a second chance. To the outside world, Rebecca was a hero. A single woman who dedicated her life to adopting children from broken homes, giving them stability, love, and opportunity. She'd been featured in local newspapers, invited to speak at fundraisers, and even appeared on a morning talk show once to discuss the rewards of adoption. People called her a saint. Mothers in her neighborhood looked at her with a mixture of admiration and guilt, wondering how she managed to care for so many children when they could barely handle two. But Rebecca Thornfield wasn't a saint. She was a predator. And her victims were the children she claimed to save. The scheme had started small, almost by accident, 15 years earlier. Rebecca had been a successful real estate agent in her late 30s, unmarried, childless, and facing a future that felt increasingly empty. She'd never been particularly maternal, but societal pressure and a vague sense that she should want children led her to explore adoption. Not because she wanted to be a mother, but because it seemed like the thing successful, respectable women did when they reached a certain age. She'd attended an informational session about foster care and adoption, and that's when she learned something interesting. Very interesting. The financial incentives were substantial. Monthly stipend payments for each child, varying based on the child's age and special needs. Medical coverage. Educational subsidies. Tax deductions. And for children with documented disabilities or trauma histories, the payments increased significantly. Rebecca's mind, always calculating, always looking for angles, started doing math. One child meant roughly $1,500 a month in subsidies, plus medical coverage, plus tax benefits. 2 children doubled that. 3 tripled it. And if those children had special needs, documented trauma, or required specialized care, the payments could reach $3,000 or more per child monthly. She'd sat in that informational session, surrounded by earnest couples who genuinely wanted to help children, and she'd seen something entirely different. She'd seen a business opportunity. Within 6 months, Rebecca had her first placement. A 13-year-old boy named Marcus, removed from his biological parents due to neglect. He came with a file documenting behavioral issues, attachment disorder, and learning disabilities. The state paid Rebecca $2,800 monthly to care for him, plus covered all his medical and therapy costs. Rebecca played the part perfectly. She attended meetings with social workers, took Marcus to his appointments, kept detailed records of his progress. But at home, things were different. Marcus lived in a small room in the basement, ate simple, cheap meals, and was expected to stay out of sight when Rebecca had guests. She wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She didn't beat him or scream at him. She simply kept him at a distance, treated him less like a child and more like an inconvenient obligation that came with a paycheck. Marcus stayed for 2 years before aging out of the system at 18. During that time, Rebecca collected over $67,000 in subsidies and benefits. She'd spent perhaps $15,000 on his actual care, if that. The rest went into her accounts, padding her lifestyle, funding her shopping habits and vacations. And she realized something. This worked. This really, really worked. So she did it again. And again. And again. Over the next 13 years, Rebecca Thornfield adopted or fostered 15 children. Not all at once, she was too smart for that. She cycled them through carefully, usually maintaining 3 to 5 children in her home at any given time. She targeted specific types of kids. Teenagers mostly because younger children required more visible care and drew more attention. Kids with documented trauma or disabilities because they came with higher payments. Kids from out of state when possible because it made oversight more complicated. She became an expert at working the system. She knew exactly what to say in home studies, how to present herself to social workers, which documents to forge or manipulate to maximize payments. She learned how to get children classified as special needs even when they weren't, how to claim therapeutic services she never actually provided, how to bill for educational expenses that never happened. She created an entire infrastructure around the fraud. She found doctors willing to sign off on diagnoses in exchange for cash payments. She located therapists who'd provide documentation of sessions that never occurred. She established relationships with homeschool oversight organizations that asked minimal questions. She even found lawyers who'd help her navigate interstate adoption laws, enabling her to bring in children from states with less rigorous oversight. The money poured in. Over 15 years, Rebecca collected approximately $7.8 million in adoption subsidies, foster care payments, Medicaid reimbursements, Social Security benefits for disabled children, educational grants, and charitable donations from people who believed they were supporting her noble work with troubled youth. She lived lavishly. The Westchester estate, purchased for $2.3 million. The Mercedes, upgraded every 3 years. Designer clothes, jewelry, exotic vacations. She joined exclusive clubs, donated strategically to maintain her reputation, and cultivated an image of wealthy philanthropist with a heart of gold. And the children? They lived in the basement and attic rooms of her sprawling home, out of sight, out of mind. They ate cheap food, wore thrift store clothes, and were homeschooled through bare minimum online programs that required little actual instruction. They had no friends, no activities, no normal childhood experiences. Rebecca kept them isolated, moved them frequently between rooms to avoid neighbors noticing, and maintained strict control over their contact with the outside world. Some aged out at 18 and left, confused and damaged but free. Others Rebecca strategically disrupted, adoption terminology for ending a placement, when they became too difficult to manage or when better financial opportunities appeared. She always had plausible explanations. The child's needs exceeded her capabilities, she discovered undisclosed issues, the placement wasn't working for the child's well-being. Social workers, overwhelmed and underfunded, rarely questioned it deeply. But Rebecca made one critical mistake. She underestimated a boy named Jordan Hayes. Jordan came to Rebecca when he was 14. He'd been in the foster system since age 7, when his mother died of cancer and no relatives could be found to take him. He'd bounced through 6 placements, each one failing for various reasons, leaving him with a file that marked him as difficult, troubled, and unlikely to find a permanent home. Rebecca saw that file and saw dollar signs. A teenage boy with documented trauma, attachment issues, and behavioral problems. The state would pay premium rates, over $3,000 monthly, and expect minimal oversight given his age. Perfect. Jordan arrived at the Westchester estate on a cold March afternoon. He was quiet, watchful, carrying everything he owned in 2 garbage bags. Rebecca greeted him warmly for the social worker's benefit, showed him around the impressive first floor of the home, and promised him stability, education, and a fresh start. The social worker left satisfied. Rebecca's warmth evaporated immediately. She showed Jordan to his real room, a converted storage space in the basement with a single bed, a small desk, and a narrow window near the ceiling that let in minimal light. She explained the rules. Stay in his room except for meals and bathroom, make no noise the guests might hear, complete his online schoolwork without bothering her, ask no questions about her business or finances. Jordan had been in enough bad placements to recognize this for what it was. Not the worst he'd experienced. He'd been in homes where he was actually beaten or starved, but bad in its coldness, its transactional nature. Rebecca didn't want a son. She wanted something else, though Jordan couldn't quite figure out what. He was smart, smarter than his file suggested. The behavioral issues that had gotten him labeled difficult were actually the result of a quick mind trapped in situations he couldn't control. He'd learned to watch, to listen, to figure out what adults wanted and whether they could be trusted. And he knew immediately that Rebecca Thornfield could not be trusted. So he started paying attention. At first, it was just survival instinct. Understanding his environment, figuring out Rebecca's patterns, knowing when to stay invisible. But over weeks and months, Jordan noticed things that didn't add up. There were other kids in the house. He'd hear them sometimes, footsteps above him, muffled voices through walls. But he never saw them. Rebecca kept them separated, staggered their meal times, enforced strict schedules that ensured they never overlapped. Jordan counted at least 4 other children based on the sounds, but Rebecca only ever mentioned 2 when social workers called. He noticed the mail. Stacks of envelopes from government agencies, insurance companies, medical providers. He saw the bills too when Rebecca occasionally left papers on the kitchen counter. Enormous sums paid to her for services, treatments, educational programs. Thousands of dollars flowing in constantly. But the house didn't reflect that money, not where the children lived. The basement was cold, the food was cheap, the clothes came from donation bins. Jordan's online school program was free, no tutoring, no supplies beyond basic necessities. When he'd needed glasses, Rebecca had delayed for months and finally gotten him the cheapest frames possible. Jordan was 14, but he understood fraud when he saw it. His mother, before she got sick, had worked in accounting. She'd taught him to read bills and statements, to understand where money came from and where it went. He might not have known all the details of Rebecca's scheme, but he knew she was stealing. Stealing from the government, from programs meant to help kids like him, and somehow making it look legitimate. He also knew that speaking up would be useless. Who would believe him? A troubled foster kid with behavioral issues versus a respected, wealthy woman with 15 years of sterling reputation? He'd seen enough of the system to know how that played out. So Jordan did something smarter. He started documenting everything. It began with a notebook he'd found in a box of old-school supplies Rebecca had given him. Just a standard composition book with a black and white marbled cover, the kind kids use in school. Jordan started writing down what he observed. Dates, times, details. He noted when social workers visited and what Rebecca told them versus the reality he experienced. He documented the other children he heard but never saw. He recorded the mail he glimpsed, the phone conversations he overheard, the discrepancies between what Rebecca claimed and what actually happened. He was careful, paranoid even. He kept the notebook hidden, moved it frequently, never wrote in it where anyone might see. He developed his own shorthand, abbreviations and codes that would make sense to him but look like random notes to anyone else. 3 months into his placement, Jordan took a huge risk. Rebecca had a home office on the 2nd floor where she handled her paperwork and finances. It was off limits, door always locked. But Jordan had watched her, knew her patterns. She went grocery shopping every Tuesday morning, a routine so consistent you could set a clock by it. One Tuesday, Jordan waited until he heard her car leave. Then he picked the office lock, a skill he'd learned from an older kid in a previous placement, and slipped inside. What he found was staggering. Filing cabinets filled with documents for dozens of children, far more than he'd realized. Applications, medical records, financial statements, subsidy agreements. Ledgers showing income and expenses, the income column massive, the expense column minimal. Bank statements showing account balances in the hundreds of thousands. Folders of receipts for services never provided, bills for treatments never rendered, documentation of therapies that never happened. Jordan couldn't take the documents, that would be noticed immediately. But he had his phone, a cheap prepaid device Rebecca had given him for emergencies. He'd never used it for anything because there was no one to call and Rebecca monitored it occasionally. But now he used it to photograph everything he could in the 15 minutes before he heard the garage door opening. He photographed ledgers, bank statements, billing records, subsidy agreements, medical claims. He photographed correspondence with doctors and therapists, emails coordinating fraudulent documentation, letters from state agencies approving payments. He worked frantically, hands shaking, knowing that if Rebecca caught him, everything would end badly. He heard her car pulling in just as he finished. He shut down the phone, shoved it in his pocket, locked the office door behind him, and was back in his basement room within seconds. His heart hammered in his chest. But he'd done it. Over the next 3 years, Jordan repeated this process whenever he could safely manage it. He became a ghost in the house, invisible and observant. He documented everything in his hidden notebook. The arrival and departure of other children, the amounts Rebecca claimed for each child versus what they actually received, the fake therapy appointments, the fraudulent medical claims. He also began occasionally communicating with the other children in the house. It was risky, Rebecca enforced strict separation, but Jordan learned to leave notes, to whisper through walls, to coordinate brief conversations when Rebecca was distracted. He learned their names, their stories, how long they'd been there. There was Aisha, 16, who'd been with Rebecca for 3 years and barely remembered what normal life was like. There was Marcus Jr., no relation to the first Marcus, who was 15 and had been bounced through so many placements he'd given up hope of anything better. There were twins, Emma and Ethan, 13 years old, who Rebecca had adopted from out of state specifically because they came with double subsidies and minimal oversight. All of them confirmed what Jordan suspected. Rebecca kept them isolated, provided bare minimum care, collected maximum benefits, and maintained her public image as a devoted adoptive mother while treating them like profitable inconveniences. Jordan documented all of it. He photographed the children's living conditions when he could, recorded snippets of Rebecca's phone conversations about finances, kept meticulous notes about the discrepancies between what Rebecca claimed and reality. By the time Jordan turned 17, his documentation was comprehensive. Hundreds of notebook pages, thousands of photos on his hidden phone, a complete picture of Rebecca's 15-year fraud empire. He had evidence of financial fraud, Medicaid fraud, educational grant fraud, and child neglect. He had enough to destroy her. But he faced a problem. He was still a minor, still legally under Rebecca's guardianship, still dependent on the system that had failed him and every other child in that house. If he went to authorities and they didn't believe him, if Rebecca's reputation and lawyers shut it down, he'd be labeled as a troubled teen making false accusations. He'd be removed, placed somewhere potentially worse, and Rebecca would continue destroying lives. So Jordan waited. He kept documenting, kept gathering evidence, and he planned. He researched laws about emancipation, about what happened when foster children turned 18, about statute of limitations for fraud. He prepared for the moment when he'd have the power to act without being dismissed as just another troubled kid. That moment came 6 months before his 18th birthday, but not in the way Jordan expected. Rebecca's scheme was successful, but it required constant management. She needed to maintain the illusion of proper care, which meant periodic social worker visits, medical appointments, educational progress reports. For 15 years she'd managed these requirements successfully, coaching children on what to say, falsifying documents, maintaining her reputation. But complacency had set in. She'd gotten away with it for so long that she'd become less careful. And she'd made the mistake of underestimating Jordan. In November of his 17th year, Jordan's assigned social worker, a new young woman named Lisa Chen, scheduled a home visit. These were routine, happened every few months, usually announced in advance so Rebecca could prepare. But Lisa had concerns. She'd reviewed Jordan's file, seen the pattern of failed placements, and wanted to ensure this one was actually working. She showed up 3 hours early, unannounced. Rebecca panicked. She wasn't prepared. The house wasn't staged properly. The other children weren't hidden. And Jordan, who normally she'd coached to give positive responses, was in his basement room reading. Lisa knocked on the door. Rebecca answered, flustered but trying to hide it, making excuses about the early arrival catching her off guard. Lisa apologized but said she'd been in the area and thought she'd stop by. Could she see Jordan? Rebecca had no choice but to agree. She went to get Jordan from the basement, whispering urgent instructions about what to say, threats about consequences if he messed this up. Jordan nodded, gave no indication that anything was wrong, and followed her upstairs. But as they passed through the kitchen, Lisa noticed something. A child's backpack on the floor, not Jordan's. She asked about it casually. Rebecca stammered, said it belonged to Jordan, he must have left it there. But Lisa had just seen Jordan come from the basement without it, and the backpack had a girl's name written on it in marker. She asked again more directly. Did Rebecca have other children in the home? Rebecca's instinct was to lie. She started explaining that it belonged to a neighbor's child who sometimes visited. But Lisa wasn't buying it. She asked to see the rest of the house. Rebecca had to comply. Social workers had the authority to inspect living conditions. She led Lisa through the first floor, all perfect and pristine, then reluctantly up to the second floor. Lisa opened doors, looked in rooms, and found Emma, one of the 13-year-old twins, sitting on a bed in a small converted attic space. Rebecca tried to explain. Emma was another child in her care, she'd forgotten to mention her in recent reports, an oversight. But Lisa was now deeply suspicious. She asked to see documentation, asked why Emma wasn't in the system reports, asked to speak with Emma privately. Everything was unraveling. And Jordan, watching this happen, realized this was his moment. It was imperfect, earlier than he'd planned, but it was his chance. While Rebecca was distracted with Lisa and Emma, he ran back to his basement room, grabbed his hidden notebook and phone, and shoved them into his jacket pockets. When he came back upstairs, Lisa was questioning Rebecca more aggressively. How many children were currently in the home? Why weren't they all documented? What were the living arrangements? Rebecca was struggling, her carefully maintained facade cracking. Jordan spoke up. He said there were 5 children total in the house including him, all kept separated, all listed under different paperwork to maximize subsidies. He said Rebecca collected money for therapies and services that never happened, that she'd been doing this for years, that he had evidence. Rebecca's face went white, then red. She screamed at Jordan, called him a liar, a troubled kid making up stories to cause problems. She told Lisa not to listen to him, that he had behavioral issues, that this was exactly the kind of manipulation his file warned about. But Lisa looked at Jordan, really looked at him, and saw something that made her pause. He wasn't hysterical or emotional. He was calm, direct, and he'd pulled out a notebook and phone, holding them like they meant something. Lisa made a decision. She told Rebecca she was calling her supervisor and that no one was leaving until this was sorted out. Rebecca protested, threatened legal action, invoked her lawyers and her reputation. But Lisa had seen enough irregularities to justify further investigation. Within 2 hours, Lisa's supervisor arrived, along with a police officer. They interviewed all 5 children separately, found their living conditions, reviewed what documentation Rebecca could provide. The discrepancies were obvious and damning. And when they asked Jordan about the notebook and phone he'd mentioned, he showed them everything. Hundreds of pages of detailed observations, dates, names, financial figures. Thousands of photos documenting Rebecca's files, her ledgers, her fraudulent claims. It was comprehensive, organized, and devastating. Rebecca Thornfield was arrested that night. The charges initially were fraud and child neglect, but as investigators dug deeper, the full scope of her crimes emerged. Federal fraud, Medicaid fraud, tax fraud, identity theft, forgery, child endangerment. The list grew longer as forensic accountants traced the money, as former foster children came forward with their stories, as the 15-year scheme unraveled completely. The children were removed from the home immediately. Jordan and the others were placed in emergency foster care while the system figured out what to do with them. For Jordan it was bittersweet. He was free from Rebecca but thrown back into system uncertainty. Still, he'd done it. He'd exposed her. The media coverage was immediate and intense. The story had everything people couldn't look away from. A wealthy woman living in luxury while exploiting vulnerable children, a massive fraud scheme, a brave teenager who documented everything, and a dramatic arrest. Rebecca's face was plastered across news sites and social media, her reputation destroyed overnight. People who'd admired her, donated to her, praised her charitable work now expressed shock and disgust. Neighbors were interviewed, all claiming they'd always thought something seemed off, though none had said anything before. The charities and organizations that had honored Rebecca scrambled to distance themselves. Rebecca hired the best defense lawyers money could buy, a team from a Manhattan firm known for getting wealthy clients out of seemingly impossible situations. They immediately went on the offensive, attacking Jordan's credibility, claiming he was a troubled teen with a history of behavioral problems who'd fabricated evidence to hurt a woman who'd tried to help him. They filed motions to suppress his documentation, arguing it was obtained illegally when Jordan broke into Rebecca's office. They presented character witnesses who spoke of Rebecca's decades of community service and charitable work. They suggested that any financial irregularities were innocent mistakes, oversight failures, not criminal fraud. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Matthews, built their case methodically. They weren't relying solely on Jordan's documentation, though it was crucial. They'd subpoenaed Rebecca's financial records, interviewed the doctors and therapists who'd provided fraudulent documentation, tracked every dollar she'd received versus what she'd spent on actual child care. Forensic accountants testified that Rebecca had collected $7.8 million in benefits over 15 years while spending approximately $1.2 million on actual child-related expenses. The remaining $6.6 million had funded her lavish lifestyle. Former foster children, now adults, testified about their experiences in Rebecca's home. They described the isolation, the minimal care, the sense that they were commodities rather than children. Some had suspected fraud but hadn't known how to report it or hadn't been believed when they tried. Medical professionals testified about the fake diagnoses, the therapy sessions that never happened, the educational services that existed only on paper. Teachers from the online homeschool program confirmed that the children received bare minimum instruction despite Rebecca claiming intensive specialized education. But the defense kept hammering at Jordan. They painted him as the mastermind, a manipulative teenager who'd resented his placement and concocted an elaborate scheme to destroy the woman who'd taken him in. They suggested he'd fabricated the documentation, photoshopped images, made up stories to convince other children to lie. It was ugly, brutal, and it took a toll on Jordan. He testified for 2 days, cross-examined mercilessly, his entire history picked apart. Every behavioral issue, every failed placement, every time he'd acted out as a traumatized child was used against him. The defense tried to make him look like a con artist, a troubled kid who couldn't be trusted. But Jordan didn't break. He answered every question calmly, explained his documentation process clearly, provided details that couldn't be fabricated. And crucially, his evidence was corroborated by everything else the prosecution had gathered. The financial records matched his observations, the other children confirmed his accounts, the paper trail supported what his notebook showed. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with media, former foster children, advocacy groups, and people who'd followed the case obsessively. Guilty on all counts. Rebecca showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but her lawyers immediately announced they'd appeal. The case wasn't over, they claimed, justice hadn't been served. But sentencing was yet to come. And that's when things got even more dramatic. Federal sentencing guidelines for the charges Rebecca faced carried significant prison time, potentially 20 to 30 years when combined. But the judge assigned to the case, the Honorable Patricia Morrison, had a reputation. She'd been a family court judge before being appointed to federal court, had spent decades working with vulnerable children and families. She understood systemic failures, understood how children fell through cracks, understood how people like Rebecca exploited those gaps. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 3 months after the verdict, giving both sides time to prepare arguments. The defense would argue for leniency, Rebecca's age, her lack of prior criminal record, her supposed contributions to society. The prosecution would argue for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the scope of fraud, the number of victims, the calculated nature of the crimes. But Judge Morrison also did something unusual. She requested that Jordan's complete documentation, the original notebook and phone, be brought to her chambers for review. She wanted to read it herself, understand exactly what this teenager had observed and recorded over 3 years. She spent weeks going through it. Hundreds of pages of careful observations, dated entries, detailed accounts of Rebecca's fraud. Photos of documents, financial records, living conditions. It was meticulous, organized, and heartbreaking. This child had essentially conducted a 3-year investigation while living as a victim of the crime he was documenting. Judge Morrison also read Jordan's personal entries, scattered throughout the notebook between the evidence. His thoughts, his fears, his hopes. Entries about missing his mother, about wondering if anyone would ever believe him, about whether he'd ever have a normal life. Entries about the other children in the house, worrying about what would happen to them. Entries about wanting to stop Rebecca not just for himself but for every child who'd come before and every child who might come after. It gave Judge Morrison a complete picture not just of the crime but of its impact. These weren't abstract victims of financial fraud. These were real children whose childhoods had been stolen, who'd been treated as income sources, who'd lived in isolation and neglect while Rebecca lived in luxury. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was even more packed than during the verdict. Rebecca sat at the defense table in a conservative suit, her lawyers flanking her. Jordan sat with the prosecution, now 18 years old, legally emancipated, living in transitional housing while finishing high school. The defense presented their arguments first. They emphasized Rebecca's age, 62 now, suggesting that decades in prison would essentially be a life sentence. They pointed to her lack of violent criminal history, her community ties, her charitable work outside of the fraud. They argued that prison wouldn't serve any rehabilitative purpose and that house arrest with restitution would be more appropriate. They also, shamefully, continued to attack Jordan and the other children. They suggested the children had exaggerated their experiences, that Rebecca had provided adequate care, that the financial discrepancies were accounting errors rather than deliberate fraud. The prosecution countered with victim impact statements. Jordan spoke, describing what it felt like to live as a commodity, to watch Rebecca spend money on luxuries while he wore donated clothes and ate cheap food. Other former foster children spoke, some now adults, sharing their experiences in Rebecca's home. One woman, Sarah, who'd been in Rebecca's care 10 years earlier, described how she tried to tell her social worker something was wrong, but Rebecca had convinced them Sarah was a troubled liar. Sarah had aged out of the system at 18, struggled with homelessness and addiction, and was only now, at 28, beginning to rebuild her life. She looked directly at Rebecca and said that what hurt most wasn't the neglect or the fraud, it was being made invisible, being treated as less than human. The prosecution also presented their sentencing recommendation: 40 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under guidelines for the combined charges. They argued that Rebecca's crimes weren't just financial, they were a betrayal of the most vulnerable children in the system, a calculated exploitation that lasted 15 years and affected dozens of lives. When all arguments were complete, Judge Morrison took a long moment before speaking. The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting to hear what sentence would be imposed. Judge Morrison began by addressing Rebecca directly. She said that in her 40 years in the legal system, she'd seen many types of criminals. People who committed crimes of desperation, of passion, of stupidity. But Rebecca's crimes were different. They were calculated, sustained, and targeted at the most vulnerable members of society. She talked about how the foster care system existed to protect children who'd already suffered trauma, loss, and instability. People who worked within that system, whether as social workers or foster parents or adoptive parents, took on a sacred trust to care for these children, to help them heal, to give them stability and hope. Rebecca had violated that trust in the most egregious way possible, viewing vulnerable children as income sources, exploiting them financially while providing minimal care. Judge Morrison then did something unexpected. She held up Jordan's notebook, the original composition book with the black and white marbled cover. She said she'd read every page, studied every entry, and been moved by what she'd found. She described it as one of the most remarkable documents she'd encountered in her career, a testament to a child's courage, intelligence, and determination to seek justice not just for himself but for others. She read several entries aloud. One where Jordan described feeling invisible, wondering if anyone cared that he and other children were being exploited. Another where he worried that no one would believe him because he was just a foster kid with issues. A third where he wrote about his mother, how she taught him that documentation mattered, that truth could be proven with evidence, and how he hoped he was making her proud by trying to expose what was wrong. The courtroom was silent except for quiet crying from several people, including some jurors who'd remained to watch the sentencing. Judge Morrison said that Jordan, at 14 years old, had done what the system failed to do for 15 years. He'd investigated, documented, and ultimately exposed a massive fraud. He'd done it while living as a victim with no resources, no support, and no guarantee anyone would ever listen. And he'd done it not for himself alone, but because he believed it was right. Then she turned back to Rebecca. She said that the defense had argued for leniency based on Rebecca's age and lack of prior record. But Judge Morrison saw it differently. Rebecca wasn't a young person who'd made a mistake. She was a mature adult who'd spent 15 years deliberately exploiting children. The lack of prior record didn't indicate good character, it indicated that she'd simply never been caught before. The defense had argued that Rebecca had provided adequate care and that any financial issues were mistakes. But Judge Morrison had reviewed the evidence thoroughly. Rebecca had lived in a mansion while children lived in converted storage spaces. She'd driven a Mercedes while children wore thrift store clothes. She'd taken exotic vacations while children ate the cheapest food possible. The disparity wasn't a mistake. It was the entire point. Judge Morrison said that federal sentencing guidelines allowed for significant deviation when circumstances warranted it. In this case, she believed they did. The scope of the fraud, the number of victims, the sustained nature of the crime, and the complete lack of remorse all justified an enhanced sentence. Then she announced the sentence and the courtroom erupted. 40 years on the federal fraud charges, to run consecutively with additional years for each count of child endangerment, tax fraud, identity theft, and other charges. When combined and calculated, the total sentence was effectively life in prison. 120 years with no possibility of parole for at least 30 years. It wasn't literally the 500-year sentence from clickbait headlines, but it might as well have been. Rebecca was 62. Even with the earliest possible release, she'd be 92. She would almost certainly die in prison. Rebecca's lawyers immediately objected, calling the sentence excessive and cruel. They began yelling about appeals, about judicial overreach, about how this was more than convicted murderers received. Judge Morrison silenced them with a single raised hand. She said that she'd considered the sentence carefully, reviewed comparable cases, and consulted sentencing guidelines. Everything she'd imposed was within her legal discretion. And she wanted to be clear about why she'd chosen the maximum possible sentence. She said that Rebecca hadn't just stolen money. She'd stolen childhoods. She'd taken vulnerable children who'd already suffered loss and trauma, and she'd exploited them for 15 years. Some of those children were now adults still struggling with the psychological damage. Others were younger, their futures uncertain. All of them had been taught by Rebecca that they were commodities, that their worth was measured in subsidy payments, that no one cared about them as human beings. Judge Morrison said that the message needed to be clear. People who exploited vulnerable children would face the most severe consequences the law allowed. The foster care and adoption systems, flawed as they were, existed to protect children. People who violated that sacred trust, who saw those systems as opportunities for profit, would be held accountable with every tool available. She also addressed the systemic failures that had allowed Rebecca's scheme to continue for 15 years. She said that social workers were overworked and underfunded, that oversight was inadequate, that the system made it too easy for people like Rebecca to exploit gaps. She called for reforms, for better monitoring, for more resources devoted to actually protecting vulnerable children rather than just processing paperwork. But she emphasized that systemic failures didn't excuse individual evil. Rebecca Thornfield had made conscious choices every single day for 15 years. She'd chosen luxury over basic care for children. She'd chosen fraud over honesty. She'd chosen exploitation over compassion. Those choices had consequences, and those consequences were the sentence Judge Morrison had just imposed. Rebecca was taken into custody immediately. As bailiffs led her out of the courtroom, she finally showed emotion. She was crying, protesting, saying this wasn't fair, that she'd cared for those children, that she didn't deserve this. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The courtroom had heard the evidence, seen the documentation, understood exactly what she'd done. Jordan watched her being led away. He felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that it was over, that Rebecca would never hurt another child. Sadness for all the years lost, for all the children who'd suffered. And something like hope, that maybe the system would learn, would change, would protect kids better in the future. After the sentencing, Jordan was approached by reporters, advocacy groups, lawyers offering to help with various matters. It was overwhelming. Sarah Matthews, the prosecutor, helped shield him, getting him out of the courthouse through a side entrance. In the days after the sentencing, the case continued to dominate media coverage. Legal experts debated whether the sentence was appropriate, with most agreeing that while harsh, it was justified given the scope and nature of Rebecca's crimes. Child welfare organizations used the case to push for reforms in oversight and monitoring of foster and adoptive homes. Several investigations were launched into the doctors, therapists, and lawyers who'd facilitated Rebecca's fraud. Some faced criminal charges themselves for their roles in creating fraudulent documentation. Others lost licenses or faced civil penalties. The network that had enabled Rebecca's 15-year scheme was being systematically dismantled. The state child welfare agency underwent a complete overhaul. The director resigned amid pressure, and an independent investigation revealed that numerous red flags about Rebecca's placements had been either missed or ignored over the years. Social workers had noted in reports that they rarely saw all the children Rebecca claimed to have, that the children seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn, that financial documentation sometimes didn't add up. But these concerns had never been escalated, never investigated thoroughly. The investigation found that Rebecca had strategically cultivated relationships with specific social workers, ones who were overworked, burned out, or willing to take her reputation at face value. She'd made generous donations to foster care charities, had hosted appreciation events for caseworkers, had positioned herself as someone who made their jobs easier by taking difficult placements. In return, she'd received minimal scrutiny. The systemic failures were damning. New protocols were implemented. Mandatory unannounced home visits, required individual interviews with each child in a home, financial audits of families receiving substantial subsidies, better coordination between state agencies to track children across jurisdictions. Whether these reforms would be adequately funded and enforced remained to be seen, but the Thornfield case had at least forced the conversation. Jordan, meanwhile, was trying to build a normal life for the first time in years. He turned 18 shortly before the sentencing, had been granted emancipation, and was now living in a transitional housing program for former foster youth. He was finishing high school through an accelerated program, preparing for college, and working with a therapist to process everything he'd experienced. The media attention was intense and often unwelcome. Everyone wanted to interview the brave teenager who'd exposed the fraud queen, who'd documented everything in secret, who'd brought down a 15-year criminal enterprise. Jordan declined most requests. He wasn't interested in being famous or being treated as a hero. He'd done what needed to be done, what was right, but he didn't want his entire identity defined by it. Sarah Matthews stayed in touch with him, checking in periodically, helping him navigate the overwhelming aftermath. She'd prosecuted many cases, but Jordan's courage and intelligence had impressed her deeply. She wanted to make sure he had support, that he didn't fall through the cracks of the system again. Through Sarah, Jordan learned what happened to the other children who'd been in Rebecca's home. Aisha, the 16-year-old, had been placed with her relatives in another state and was doing better, attending regular school for the first time in years. The twins, Emma and Ethan, had been adopted by a couple who'd been screened far more thoroughly than any of Rebecca's paperwork had been. Marcus Jr. had aged out shortly after the arrest and was struggling somewhat, but connected to support services. Jordan stayed in contact with some of them, a shared bond formed by their experience in Rebecca's house. They'd all testified during the trial, had all faced similar attacks on their credibility from the defense, had all watched Rebecca finally face consequences. There was something healing about that shared experience, about being believed after years of being invisible. But the case wasn't quite over. True to their word, Rebecca's lawyers filed extensive appeals. They challenged the sentence as excessive, argued that evidence had been improperly admitted, claimed that Judge Morrison had been biased. The appeals process would take years, grinding through various courts, eating up resources and time. Rebecca sat in federal prison throughout this process, housed in a medium-security facility in Pennsylvania. She maintained her innocence, told anyone who'd listen that she'd been railroaded by a troubled teenager and an overzealous prosecutor. Other inmates knew why she was there. The news coverage had been too extensive for anonymity, and child exploitation wasn't popular in prison. Rebecca spent most of her time in protective custody, isolated for her own safety. She gave one interview from prison 6 months after sentencing, to a journalist writing a book about the case. In it, she continued to position herself as a victim. She claimed she'd devoted her life to helping troubled children, that Jordan had been manipulative and ungrateful, that the financial discrepancies were honest mistakes blown out of proportion. When asked about the evidence, the ledgers showing millions collected versus minimal spending on children, she claimed they'd been taken out of context, that she'd planned to use that money for the children eventually, that it wasn't fraud, just poor planning. When confronted with testimony from multiple former foster children describing neglect and exploitation, she suggested they'd been coached, influenced by Jordan's lies. The interview was disturbing in its complete lack of self-awareness or remorse. Even facing decades in prison, even with overwhelming evidence of her guilt, Rebecca couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge what she'd done. She remained convinced that she was the real victim in this situation. The journalist published the interview as part of a broader book about the case, titled The Fraud House: How One Woman Built an Empire on Stolen Childhoods. The book was meticulously researched, including interviews with Jordan, other victims, prosecutors, social workers, and experts on foster care fraud. It became a bestseller, sparking renewed conversation about how the system failed vulnerable children. Jordan contributed to the book reluctantly, after much consideration. He didn't want attention, but he did want the full story told. He wanted people to understand that his case wasn't unique, that foster care fraud happened more often than people realized, that vulnerable children were exploited in various ways by people who were supposed to protect them. The book included excerpts from Jordan's notebook, published with his permission. Readers found them heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. The entries of a 14-year-old boy documenting fraud while worrying about whether he'd ever have a real home, while missing his deceased mother, while trying to protect other children even as he himself was being exploited. One entry in particular resonated with readers. Jordan had written it about 6 months into living in Rebecca's house, after he'd realized the scope of what she was doing but before he'd started photographing evidence. He wrote, "I don't know if anyone will ever read this. I don't know if what I'm writing even matters. But my mom used to say that the truth matters even if no one's listening yet, because eventually someone will listen. She said that keeping records of the truth is how you fight back against people who lie. So I'm keeping records. I'm writing down what's real, even if it's just for me, even if no one ever believes me. Because someday maybe they will. And when they do, I'll have proof. I'll have shown them exactly what she is and what she's done. Not just to me but to everyone. That has to count for something. It has to." That entry became emblematic of the entire case. A child's determination to document truth in the face of overwhelming power imbalance, a belief that evidence mattered, that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. Educational institutions began using the Thornfield case in their curricula. Law schools taught it in courses on fraud prosecution and sentencing discretion. Social work programs used it as a case study in system failures and warning signs. Criminal justice courses examined it as an example of how vulnerable populations could be exploited and how oversight systems needed reform. Child advocacy organizations used Jordan's story in their awareness campaigns and fundraising efforts. They highlighted how one child's courage had exposed massive fraud, but also emphasized that children shouldn't have to be investigators and whistleblowers. The system should protect them before exploitation occurred, not rely on victims to document their own abuse. Jordan graduated high school with honors and received a full scholarship to Columbia University. Multiple scholarship programs had reached out, wanting to support the young man who'd shown such courage and intelligence. He chose Columbia partly for the academic reputation, but also because Sarah Matthews had connections there and could help him navigate college while dealing with ongoing media attention and the appeals process. He decided to major in social work and public policy. His experience had shown him how systems failed vulnerable people, and he wanted to be part of fixing those systems. Not through dramatic exposures like his documentation of Rebecca, but through careful, sustained work to change policies, improve oversight, and ensure that children in care received actual protection. During his freshman year, Jordan was invited to testify before a congressional committee examining foster care fraud and system oversight. He was 19 now, more comfortable speaking publicly, though still private by nature. He prepared carefully for his testimony, working with child welfare advocates to ensure his statements would be effective in pushing for reform. His testimony was powerful and measured. He didn't just tell his own story, though he included it. He talked about the systemic issues that had enabled Rebecca's 15-year scheme. Inadequate oversight, overworked social workers, insufficient funding, poor coordination between agencies, lack of independent advocates for children in care. He presented specific policy recommendations: mandatory unannounced home visits with individual child interviews, financial audits for families receiving substantial subsidies, independent advocates appointed for every child in long-term care, better whistleblower protections for children trying to report abuse or fraud, increased funding for social services to reduce caseloads. He was questioned by committee members from both parties, some sympathetic, others skeptical about the cost of implementing his recommendations. Jordan remained calm and factual, pointing out that Rebecca had stolen nearly $8 million from taxpayers while children suffered. Investing in proper oversight would actually save money by preventing fraud, while also protecting vulnerable children. His testimony was covered extensively in media and was credited with helping push through modest reforms in federal foster care funding, including requirements for states to implement better monitoring systems to continue receiving federal money. But not everyone saw Jordan as a hero. Some critics, particularly those ideologically opposed to government oversight, used the Thornfield case to argue that the foster system itself was broken and should be dismantled. They suggested that private charity would do better than government programs, ignoring that Rebecca had exploited both government subsidies and charitable donations. Others criticized Jordan personally, suggesting he should have reported Rebecca immediately rather than spending 3 years documenting. They argued that other children had suffered during that time because Jordan was playing detective instead of getting help. These criticisms stung, even though Jordan knew they came from people who didn't understand the reality of being a powerless teenager in a system that often didn't believe foster kids. Sarah Matthews publicly defended Jordan in these instances, pointing out that he'd been 14 years old, alone, with a file full of behavioral issues that made him easy to dismiss. He'd made the strategic choice to gather undeniable evidence rather than make allegations that would be written off as a troubled teen acting out. That choice had ultimately been vindicated by the successful prosecution. Rebecca's appeals slowly worked through the system. Every court that reviewed the case upheld the conviction and sentence. The First Circuit Court of Appeals issued a detailed opinion explaining why Judge Morrison's sentence was appropriate given the scope of Rebecca's crimes and the number of victims. The opinion noted that Rebecca had shown no remorse, had continued to exploit the system even during pretrial release by attempting to claim she needed funds from her frozen accounts for child-related expenses, and represented an ongoing danger to vulnerable populations. The appeals exhausted, Rebecca's sentence became final 3 years after the initial trial. She would spend the rest of her life in federal prison. Her estate, ceased to pay restitution, was liquidated. The Westchester mansion sold, the Mercedes auctioned, her jewelry and luxury goods sold off. The proceeds went into a restitution fund for her victims. Every child who'd been in Rebecca's care was eligible for restitution based on how long they'd lived there and the amount Rebecca had fraudulently claimed for their care versus what she'd actually spent. Jordan received approximately $240,000, representing the difference between what Rebecca collected for him and what she'd spent on his actual care over 3 years. He used part of it for college expenses not covered by scholarship, saved the rest. The money felt strange to him, simultaneously meaningful as acknowledgement of what he'd suffered and inadequate as compensation for 3 years of his childhood. But he accepted it, knowing it was at least something, more than many victims of exploitation ever received. Other victims received varying amounts based on their time in Rebecca's care. For some, It was life-changing money that funded education or provided stability. For others, particularly those who'd aged out of the system years ago and struggled with addiction or instability, the money was gone quickly, unable to undo the damage Rebecca had caused. The case continued to resonate in unexpected ways. It inspired tighter regulations in multiple states about financial oversight of foster and adoptive families. It led to the creation of new advocacy organizations focused specifically on preventing foster care fraud. It even influenced popular culture, with several crime podcasts covering it in detail, a television movie dramatizing the case, and references in shows about criminal justice. Jordan remained uncomfortable with the attention, but he understood its value. Every time the case was discussed, it reminded people that vulnerable children needed protection, that systems required oversight, that fraud could hide behind respectability and reputation. By his junior year at Columbia, Jordan had become involved with a nonprofit organization working on foster care reform. He started as an intern, then became a youth advocate, working with current and former foster youth to help them navigate the system, understand their rights and access resources. It was meaningful work, using his experience to help others in similar situations. He also began speaking at social work conferences and training sessions, teaching future social workers about warning signs of exploitation, about the importance of actually listening to children, about how documentation and evidence could reveal what wasn't visible on the surface. His presentations were always well received, grounded in his personal experience but expanded to address broader systemic issues. During one presentation at a national child welfare conference, Jordan was approached by a woman in her late 30s. She introduced herself as Diana Porter, a former social worker who'd handled several of Rebecca's cases years ago. She was crying as she apologized to Jordan. She said she'd been one of Rebecca's assigned workers early in the scheme, had done home visits, filed reports. She'd had concerns sometimes, vague feelings that something was off, but she'd never investigated thoroughly. She'd been overwhelmed with her caseload, grateful that Rebecca seemed competent and stable, and she'd let those concerns slide. She said she'd left social work shortly after, burned out and feeling ineffective, and had only learned about Rebecca's arrest years later when the case made national news. Diana said she'd been haunted by it ever since, wondering if she'd failed those children, if she should have seen what was happening. She'd followed Jordan's advocacy work and wanted to tell him how sorry she was, how much she respected what he'd done, and how his work was helping ensure that other social workers wouldn't make the same mistakes she had. Jordan listened to her apology, then surprised her by thanking her for it. He said that individual social workers weren't the problem, the system that overworked them and gave them impossible caseloads was the problem. He said that he didn't blame workers like her who'd been trying their best in a broken system. He blamed people like Rebecca who deliberately exploited that broken system, and he blamed policymakers who underfunded child welfare while expecting perfect results. The conversation between Jordan and Diana became the basis for a new initiative they developed together, a training program for social workers focused on recognizing and investigating potential fraud or exploitation in foster and adoptive homes. The program combined Diana's professional experience with Jordan's lived experience, creating something uniquely valuable. They trained hundreds of social workers over the next few years, always emphasizing that protecting children required both compassion and healthy skepticism, that reputation and respectability could hide exploitation, that listening to children and taking their concerns seriously was crucial. Meanwhile, inside federal prison, Rebecca's health deteriorated. She developed diabetes, struggled with high blood pressure, and showed signs of early dementia. She was transferred to a prison medical facility, where she spent most of her time in confused states, sometimes not remembering where she was or why she was there. Some advocates argued she should be released on compassionate grounds, that keeping a sick elderly woman in prison served no purpose. Others, particularly victims advocates and former foster children from her home, argued that her declining health didn't erase her crimes, that she'd stolen decades from vulnerable children and should spend her remaining years in prison regardless of her condition. The Bureau of Prisons denied her compassionate release petition. She remained incarcerated, receiving medical care but no special consideration. She died in prison at age 71, 9 years after her initial sentencing, having served only a fraction of her sentence but having spent her final years behind bars. Jordan learned of her death through a news alert on his phone. He was 27 by then, working as a policy analyst for a child welfare reform organization, living in Washington, D.C., in a relationship with someone who understood and supported his work. He sat with the news for a long time, trying to understand what he felt. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. Rebecca's death didn't undo anything she'd done, didn't return stolen childhoods to him or the others. But it was closure of a sort. She was gone, would never hurt another child, would never profit from exploitation again. That mattered. He wrote a brief statement that was included in news coverage of her death. Rebecca Thornfield's death ends a life that caused tremendous harm to vulnerable children. My hope is that her legacy isn't just the crimes she committed, but the reforms those crimes inspired. We've made progress in protecting children in foster care, but more work remains. That work continues, and it matters more than any individual case. The statement was vintage Jordan, measured, focused on systemic change rather than personal vindication. It reflected how he'd grown from a traumatized 14-year-old documenting fraud in a basement to a mature advocate working to prevent others from experiencing what he had. The Thornfield case continued to be taught and studied years after Rebecca's death. It remained relevant because the issues it exposed, foster care fraud, systemic oversight failures, exploitation of vulnerable children, remained persistent problems. New cases would occasionally surface, smaller in scope than Rebecca's scheme but following similar patterns, each one prompting renewed discussion and comparison to the Thornfield case. Jordan became a recognized expert in foster care policy, frequently consulted by legislators, agencies, and advocacy organizations. He completed his master's degree in public policy, focusing his thesis on effective oversight mechanisms for foster and adoptive homes. He published articles, testified regularly before legislative committees, and helped draft policy proposals in multiple states. He also wrote a memoir published when he was 30. He'd resisted for years, uncomfortable with the attention and with profiting from his trauma. But he eventually concluded that telling his story fully in his own words was important. Too many people knew the dramatic headlines about the fraud queen and the brave teenager, but didn't understand the daily reality of living in that house, the fear and uncertainty, the burden of documenting crimes while being a victim. The memoir, titled Invisible, A Foster Child's Fight for Justice, was critically acclaimed and commercially successful. It was raw and honest, describing not just the Thornfield case but Jordan's entire experience in foster care, the multiple placements, the trauma of losing his mother, the sense of being unwanted and disposable. But it also described resilience, the social workers who actually cared, the teachers who saw potential in him, the prosecutor who believed him, the judge who delivered justice. It wasn't a story of pure victimhood or pure triumph, it was complicated and real, showing how systems both failed and helped him. The memoir sparked renewed interest in foster care reform. Several celebrities endorsed it, using their platforms to raise awareness about the issues Jordan described. Policymakers referenced it in debates about funding and oversight. Most importantly, current and former foster youth reached out to Jordan, sharing their own stories, finding validation in seeing their experiences reflected. Jordan used his platform carefully, always trying to center the voices of people currently in the system rather than just his own story. He helped establish a youth advisory board for his organization, ensuring that policy recommendations came from people with lived experience, not just professional expertise. By his mid-30s, Jordan had accomplished more than most people achieve in a lifetime. He'd exposed massive fraud, inspired legislative reforms, built a career advocating for vulnerable children, and become a respected voice in child welfare policy. But he'd also built a personal life, something that had seemed impossible during those years in Rebecca's basement. He married his partner, adopted 2 children from foster care himself, giving them the stability and genuine care he'd longed for in his own childhood. Becoming an adoptive parent was terrifying for Jordan, haunted by Rebecca's example, constantly questioning whether he was doing enough, whether he was providing real love and support rather than just going through motions. His therapist helped him work through this, reminded him that his awareness of these concerns, his constant self-examination, was actually evidence that he was nothing like Rebecca. She'd never questioned herself, never doubted, never worried whether she was doing right by the children in her care. Jordan's hypervigilance about being a good parent stemmed from trauma but also reflected genuine care. His children thrived. They knew Jordan's story, age-appropriately shared as they grew older, and understood why their father was so passionate about foster care reform. They were proud of him and he was proud of them, proud to give them what he'd been denied for so long. A real home, genuine care, unconditional love. The Thornfield case's legacy continued through unexpected channels. Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd sentenced Rebecca, retired from the bench at 70 and became an advocate for judicial reform. She wrote extensively about sentencing discretion, about how judges needed to consider not just legal guidelines but the full context of crimes and their impacts. She cited the Thornfield case frequently as an example of why judges needed discretion. By the letter of the law, Rebecca could have received a much lighter sentence, maybe 15 or 20 years. But Judge Morrison had understood the full scope of harm, had read Jordan's notebook and understood what those crimes meant beyond dollar amounts, and had used her discretion to impose a sentence that reflected that understanding. Some legal scholars criticized her approach, arguing that harsh sentences didn't deter crime and that judicial discretion could lead to disparities. Judge Morrison engaged with these criticisms seriously, acknowledging valid concerns while maintaining that in cases like Rebecca's, where harm was extensive and remorse was absent, maximum sentences were justified. She and Jordan developed a friendship over the years, bonding over their shared experience with the case. She attended his wedding, wrote a blurb for his memoir, and consulted with him on policy proposals. She said that meeting Jordan, seeing how he'd transformed trauma into purpose, was one of the most inspiring experiences of her career. Sarah Matthews, the prosecutor, also remained in touch with Jordan. She'd eventually moved into private practice, focusing on representing victims in civil cases, but she considered the Thornfield prosecution one of her most important cases. She'd proven that even wealthy, respected people could be held accountable for exploiting vulnerable populations, that reputation didn't protect against evidence, that justice was possible. She and Jordan occasionally spoke at conferences together, offering prosecution and victim perspectives on fraud cases. Their presentations were powerful, showing how the legal system could work when prosecutors believed victims, when evidence was taken seriously, when cases were pursued despite defendants' resources and connections. The medical professionals who'd provided fraudulent documentation for Rebecca faced their own consequences. 3 doctors lost their licenses permanently, found to have falsified diagnoses and treatment records for dozens of children over the years. 2 therapists faced criminal charges for fraud, though they received much lighter sentences than Rebecca by cooperating with investigators. Several lawyers who'd helped Rebecca navigate interstate adoption laws were disbarred. These consequences sent ripples through professional communities. Medical boards tightened oversight of doctors working with foster children, therapists became more cautious about signing documentation without actually providing services, and lawyers faced increased scrutiny when handling adoption cases involving substantial benefits. The foster care system itself underwent significant reforms in multiple states, many directly inspired by lessons from the Thornfield case. Mandatory unannounced visits became standard. Financial audits of homes receiving substantial subsidies were implemented. Children in care were assigned independent advocates, not just social workers but separate individuals whose sole job was to ensure the child's needs were being met. These reforms weren't perfect or universal. Funding remained inadequate in many states, implementation varied widely, and children continued falling through cracks. But progress happened, measurable and real. Fewer children were trapped in exploitative situations for years. More fraud was detected early. Vulnerable kids had more advocates and better protections. Studies tracking outcomes showed improvements. Children who entered foster care after the Thornfield-inspired reforms experienced shorter placements on average, had better educational outcomes, and reported feeling more supported and heard by the system. The improvements were modest, not revolutionary, but they represented thousands of children whose experiences were better because of Jordan's courage in documenting Rebecca's crimes. 20 years after that November afternoon when Lisa Chen made an unannounced visit and Jordan showed her his hidden notebook, the Thornfield case remained a touchstone in discussions about child welfare, fraud prosecution, and systemic reform. Jordan was 47, still working in policy advocacy, still fighting for better protections for vulnerable children. He occasionally gave interviews about the case, particularly to journalism students and documentary filmmakers studying it as an important example of investigative impact. He always emphasized the same points, that his documentation mattered because he'd been meticulous and factual, that systems needed to be designed so children didn't have to be their own investigators, that justice required both individual accountability and systemic reform. He'd also started training foster youth who wanted to become advocates themselves, teaching them documentation skills, how to navigate bureaucracy, how to speak truth to power while protecting themselves. Some of his students went on to expose abuses in their own placements, others became policy advocates or social workers or lawyers, all carrying forward the lesson that victims could become powerful, that trauma could be transformed into purpose. Rebecca's name became shorthand for a particular type of exploitation. Adoption fraud schemes were sometimes called pulling a Thornfield in child welfare circles. Her mugshot remained one of the most recognizable images in true crime communities, alongside her smiling photos from before the arrest. The contrast between public image and private reality serving as a stark reminder of how predators often hid behind respectability. The mansion in Westchester where Jordan and other children had lived in basement and attic rooms was purchased by a non-profit and converted into a residential facility for foster youth aging out of the system. It provided transitional housing, life skills training, educational support, and counseling. Jordan attended the opening ceremony, standing in the same rooms where he'd once been kept isolated, now transformed into spaces designed to actually help young people. He gave a speech at the opening, talking about how the house represented both the worst of what could happen to foster children and the possibility of redemption and transformation. He said that Rebecca had built an empire of exploitation in those rooms, but now those same spaces would help young people build real lives, develop real skills, and receive real support. It felt like closing a circle, like justice that extended beyond courtrooms and sentences into actual healing and help. The last survivor from Rebecca's home besides Jordan, a woman named Michelle who'd been placed there at 15 and spent 2 years in that environment, also attended the opening. She and Jordan had stayed in touch over the years, both working through trauma, both building meaningful lives despite difficult starts. Michelle had become a therapist specializing in trauma, particularly childhood trauma related to system involvement. She worked with foster youth, helping them process their experiences, providing the support she'd wished someone had given her. She said that her time in Rebecca's house, horrible as it was, had taught her something valuable, that survival was possible, that people could endure terrible things and still build good lives afterward. She and Jordan stood together in what had been the basement where Jordan first documented Rebecca's fraud, now converted to a computer lab where transitional youth could learn job skills and complete educational programs. They didn't say much, just acknowledged the strange poetry of the moment, how horror had been transformed into help, how the worst things sometimes inspired the best responses. As the years continued passing, new generations learned about the Thornfield case in classrooms and training programs, each iteration teaching slightly different lessons as society's understanding of trauma, justice, and child welfare evolved. The case remained relevant not because it was unique, but because it wasn't, because the exploitation Rebecca engaged in happened in less dramatic forms constantly, because vulnerable children remained at risk from people who saw them as opportunities rather than as human beings deserving of care and dignity. Jordan, now approaching 50, sometimes reflected on how his 14-year-old self would view his current life. That scared kid documenting fraud in a basement, convinced no one would believe him, hoping desperately that his evidence would matter someday. Would he have believed that his notebook would help send Rebecca to prison for life? That his documentation would inspire nationwide reforms? That he'd build a career helping vulnerable children, marry, have children of his own, transform his trauma into decades of meaningful work? Probably not. At 14, survival had been the only goal. Justice seemed like an impossible dream. The future was too uncertain to imagine. But that's what courage looked like sometimes, not confidence in ultimate triumph, but persistence despite uncertainty, documentation of truth even when vindication seemed unlikely, belief that evidence and honesty mattered even when the odds were overwhelming. Jordan's story, Rebecca's crimes, Judge Morrison's sentence, the reforms that followed, all of it became part of a larger narrative about how justice worked when systems functioned properly, when victims were believed, when evidence was taken seriously, when accountability applied regardless of wealth or status. It wasn't a perfect story. There were too many victims, too much suffering, too many systemic failures leading up to the eventual exposure. But it was a story of possibility, of how one child's courage could catalyze change, how documentation could defeat deception, how karma, delayed but inevitable, could finally catch up even to those who seemed untouchable. The black and white marbled composition notebook, the original one Jordan had used to document Rebecca's crimes, was eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on child advocacy and justice. It sat in a climate-controlled case, its pages preserved for future generations, a physical reminder of how evidence, carefully gathered and courageously presented, could change lives and systems. Visitors to the exhibit would read selected entries, see the meticulous notes, the dated observations, the mix of evidence and personal reflection. They'd see a child's handwriting documenting adult crimes, a teenager's determination to expose exploitation even while experiencing it. And they'd understand something important about justice, that it required not just laws and courts and sentences, but people willing to document truth, to stand up despite personal risk, to believe that evidence and honesty could overcome power and deception. Jordan visited the exhibit once, shortly after it opened. He stood before the case holding his old notebook, Strange to see his teenage handwriting preserved as historical artifact. A young person, maybe 16, stood next to him, clearly a school group visiting the museum. The teenager asked Jordan if he knew the story behind the notebook. Jordan smiled and said yes, he knew the story pretty well. He asked what the teenager thought about it. The young person said it was inspiring but also scary, that it was hard to imagine being that alone, that scared, that determined. Jordan nodded and said it had been hard, but also that he'd learned something important. That you didn't need to be fearless to be brave, you just needed to do what was right even when you were afraid. And sometimes that was enough. The teenager thanked him and moved on with their group. Jordan stayed a moment longer, looking at the notebook, remembering that basement room, remembering Rebecca's smirk when social workers visited, remembering the fear and the determination and the hope that someday someone would listen. Someone had listened. Many people had listened. And they continued listening years later, learning from what happened, working to ensure fewer children would need to be their own investigators, their own advocates, their own documentarians of abuse. He turned from the exhibit and walked out into the Washington, D.C. sunshine, heading to his office where policy proposals waited, where advocacy work continued, where the fight to protect vulnerable children remained urgent and necessary and ongoing. Rebecca Thornfield's crimes had ended with her death in prison, but their legacy continued in the work they'd inspired, the reforms they'd catalyzed, the young people who'd been protected because systems improved. And that was the real ending to the story, not a dramatic courtroom scene or a shocking sentence, but sustained work over decades, incremental progress, thousands of small victories adding up to meaningful change. Justice wasn't just a moment, it was a process, ongoing and imperfect but essential. Jordan had learned that at 14, documenting fraud in a basement. He'd lived it for decades since, transforming trauma into purpose, evidence into advocacy, suffering into service. The story of Rebecca Thornfield and Jordan Hayes would continue being told for generations, not because it was unique, but because it represented something universal. The vulnerability of powerless children, the exploitation by those who should protect them, the courage required to expose wrongdoing, and the slow, difficult work of building systems that actually served those they were meant to help. It was a dark story, yes, but also a hopeful one, showing that even in the darkest situations, truth could emerge, justice could prevail, and one person's courage could change everything. Thank you for watching Dark Echoes Crime. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you think differently about foster care and justice, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't always dramatic action. It's persistent documentation of truth, courage to speak up even when you're afraid, and belief that evidence and honesty can overcome power and deception. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop questioning the facades that hide darkness.